Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to TechGeek webinar series, our endeavor to empower techies. We believe that sharing of knowledge is the key to enhance our skills and grow us as professionals. With this principle in mind, we have initiated a series of webinars conducted by industry experts to give you all a crisp insight of various domains. The topic of today's session is Database Conversion Workbench, an integrated approach to enabling applications on DB2. Our guest speaker today is Mr. Mallarswamy Nonvenkere, DB2 consultant at IBM India Software Labs. Mallarswamy is working as a DB2 consultant with IBM. He specializes in DB2 Pure XML technology. He works with IBM customers, business partners, and independent software vendors to help them understand the use of DB2 technologies and develop high-performance applications. He has been helping customers with best practices to get best performance from pure XML-based solutions. As part of the IBM team, he has been actively supporting DB2 migration projects for various customers and business partners. He has been actively involved in DB2 beta programs and has been answering customer queries on DB2 and educating them as and when required. Mr. Mallarswamy has been a speaker in various international conferences and has also co-authored an e-book titled Database Fundamentals. So without further delay, I introduce you all to our guest speaker. Over to you, Mr. Mallarswamy.
Thanks, Mohini, for that introduction. All right, so good evening, everyone. Like Mohini mentioned earlier, that I'm part of a team within India Software Lab that works with customers and business partners, and my primary job role responsibilities include working with them and helping them understand the various features of DB2. Many of you might have known that DB2 for LUW came up with a major release earlier this year in the month of April-May, which was named DB2 10.1. Right. So what we are going to cover in today's conversation is basically I'll give you an introduction to another tool, which is called the Database Conversion Workbench tool, and I'll take you through what this tool is and how DB2 engine capabilities, along with the capabilities of this particular tool, will allow us to enable applications predominantly which are on Oracle database to be easily moved on to DB2 without much of an effort. So with that background, I'll quickly get to this session. So I'm on chart 2, which talks about the migration roadmap. So typically when we talk to customers and business partners and give them a value proposition of DB2, and when they see that there is a lot of benefit in making use of DB2 as a data server for their data centers, for their applications, for their backend systems, then they see there is a lot of total cost of ownership to be gained, and it reduces that TCO. A lot of autonomics which is introduced as part of the various releases that we have been doing so far. With all that, when the customer is convinced that okay, DB2 has the features that I'm looking for at the best cost that is available in the market, the next step is to look at the feasibility of an application working on DB2, right? So we really want to see something in action. So that's when we look at the migration roadmap, and this is how it starts. We start with the planning and preparation phase, where we look at trying to identify the various applications that we want to test on DB2 first. And then when we have identified the applications, obviously the next step is to prepare a project plan where we decide we have the resources to make this migration happen. Do we have the skill set? Is it viable? Is it something that I can do within the timeline? Does it make sense for the business cycle that I have and all that stuff? So once we have frozen on all these terms and we see that there is a feasibility of trying this particular migration exercise, we move on to the actual implementation of it, wherein we have two major steps. One is database migration, the other one is application code migration. So our focus today would be on discussing the database migration part of it, and we will see how this DCW, or the conversion workbench, will help us in the various phases of this particular database migration. Talking about application code migration, if the code which is written is based on standard SQL statements, whether it is Oracle or any other database. In that sense, when we talk about migration, it should really be a matter of switching pointers from one database to another database, rather than having to change any code within the application program, because most of it is SQL standard, and we know that DB2 adheres to SQL standard. So most of it should work as it is, and application code migration phase should really be changing the connectivity parameters as far as the functionality of the application goes. The next important step is obviously trying to move the actual data, because most of the migrations happen when we take the production data into development and we do a POC that's more in the development phase. And when we are satisfied with the functionality, that's when we look at moving all the data and then take it to production, right? When we take into production, obviously there is a intermediate step between development and production, which is verification testing, where we have, and acceptance testing, where we make sure that all the performance considerations have been addressed and there are no lags as far as your SLAs are concerned. Now, I'll just go a little deeper into each of these steps. So like I mentioned, when we talk about planning and preparation, the first thing is, as a project manager or as an architect, the first question is, what would be the scope of my project? Because as a customer, I might have hundreds of applications and I don't really want to move all of them at once onto DB2, right? We would want to start somewhere, and that's something that we need to decide. What kind of applications am I going to enable onto DB2? So there are again considerations, things like what platforms are supported by DB2. Fortunately, most of the popular platforms, whether it's Windows or Linux platforms, are supported on DB2. So that should not really be a constraint when we're talking about enabling applications on DB2. But things like, which are the most critical applications for me? Which are the ones which are going to save me a lot of cost, a lot of CPU costs? Where am I going to save the maximum licensing cost? Where am I spending the maximum? So all of these things are considered when we look at scoping a project for migration. And then obviously there are technical details like what are the number of concurrent users, what are the kind of workload characteristics that we're looking at, the complexity of the project, when is the go live date, and what kind of database objects does it have? Does it have complex PLSQL objects? What kind of interfaces the application has? Does it have only a web interface? Is there a standalone interface? Is it just a client server architecture, or how it is? So all these things need to be considered along with the advanced features which are available with most popular databases, things like database partitioning feature, compression, and other things. So to facilitate this activity, to facilitate the assessment of or the viability of the enablement program, we have something called as the conversion assessment questionnaire. So as of today, this is basically a Word document. So whenever we get into conversation with customers and business partners, trying to tell them the approach that we take. So the first thing is we ask them to fill in this conversion assessment questionnaire. So this questionnaire is basically, it lists down various questions about the applications that they are planning to migrate or enable on DB2. So it has questions like number of users that are going to be connected, what kind of interfaces they have, or what is the kind of programming language that has been used to develop the application. And there are several other details that we capture in terms of database. So database characteristics like what could be the approximate size of the database, are there multiple partitions to it, the hardware, the operating system on which the database is currently running, and other database object details like the number of tables, indexes used, and the functionality. Does it have only SQL-based functionality, whether it's user-defined functions or stored procedures, whether they're just SQL-based, or is there are there some external functions and stored procedures which are written in maybe any other programming language like Java or C++. So what this conversion assessment questionnaire does is it allows us to get a fair idea of the complexity involved in the application as of today, and at the same time it can tell us whether it's really feasible to go ahead with migrating the application onto DB2, and if at all, what is the kind of effort that we're looking at. Now, once we have seen the conversion assessment questionnaire, we go back to the customer, and when we say that, okay, in most cases we have seen that it is possible to enable applications on DB2, because most of the stuff which is covered in Oracle is getting covered in DB2 as well. So that's when we create a project plan and we try and allocate resources to them We look at the architectural considerations, things like what hardware and software that we're looking at. Do we continue to use the same hardware, or do we procure new hardware? Because DB2 works on some of IBM hardware much better than any other regular hardware that you get in the market. And then what are the dependencies as far as the business is concerned? Does it really suit my business cycle? Does it come in between the renewal of licensing agreement that I have? So should I withhold renewal of licenses, or should I go ahead with the renewal of licenses and still have the POC going? So all these questions, again, for a project manager, they have to consider these things. Now, once we've frozen on all these, and when we say that, okay, now I can get started with my application enablement on DB2, the first step that we take is looking at the database, right? Because that's where most of our functionality lies. And in that migration phase, there are steps which I have highlighted here. So the first thing is to move the database structures. For example, every database consists of two things, right? One is metadata, and the other one is data. So metadata is basically the DDL, the database structure, which consists of tables, indexes, views, and all of that. And then you have the functionality behind it, which is in form of your stored procedures and user-defined functions, which encapsulate your day-to-day business logic, right, inside the database. So the first target is to try and move that metadata to the target database. So for people who are new to DB2, I would like to introduce you to this special compatibility feature. It's basically a registry variable in DB2. It's called the DB2 compatibility vector, which you set to special value, an hexadecimal value. On setting it to a value, what it does is it allows you to execute your PLSQL code pretty much as it is on DB2. So again, for people who haven't worked with DB2, to give you a little bit of background, DB2 has its own programming language, which is called the SQLPL, wherein you can write your own stored procedures and user-defined functions. But let's say your application is written in PLSQL because it started using Oracle initially. So you can use that same PLSQL pretty much as it is on DB2 by making use of this particular compatibility vector. So you just enable this compatibility vector, and most of the PLSQL code that lies in your existing application can be readily used onto DB2, right? Having said that, you must have noted that I'm always using the term most of them and not all of them, because there are cases where we really need to have that code tweaked a little bit here and there to make sure that it works with DB2 without any errors, right? And to do that, we have automation available. So DCW is one tool that allows us to do that. So it will automatically convert some of the code to PLSQL on its own, and it will make sure that it runs on DB2 without any problems. All right. One of the key considerations that we have seen always is the fact that at no point in time we can compromise on the data that exists in the database, because data is really critical, right? And what we're talking about is movement of data. So for that, the key thing is data type mapping. So we have always seen that as long as we have a mapping for each of the databases in the source, in the target, we are happy. So the first step is basically to try and map the existing data types. But with DB2's version 9.7 and onwards, we have seen that most of the data types which are there in Oracle are covered in DB2. So again, there is no real challenge when it comes to data type mapping now. And like I said, once that has been taken care of, we ensure that there is no data loss, because all of the data types which are available in Oracle are now available in DB2. So obviously the next step is to look at the business logic, which is encapsulated in form of UDF, stored procedures, and triggers, which can be in your PLSQL language. So that can be run on DB2, like I said, most of it as it is. And again, another important question that I often get when I talk about executing PLSQL code on DB2, the question is, are you trying to emulate it? So the answer is really no, because DB2 has native support for PLSQL code. It has a runtime engine, unified runtime engine, which can compile and execute both your SQLPL and PLSQL pretty much at the same performance level. So there is not even a performance penalty if you're using PLSQL code on DB2. Now, talking about application code migration, like I mentioned, once you've taken care of the database code migration and you ensure that there is no data loss and the database objects have been moved completely, the next step is to look at the application code, your code which is written in maybe PHP, Java, ASP programs. which has SQL statements embedded or PLSQL statements or calls to stored procedures and functions embedded in the programs. Like I said, if it's standard SQL, it really requires no effort. The only thing ideally that we would be changing is the interface parameters, things like the username and password and the port and the name of the database, because earlier those were pointing to an Oracle database, now they would be pointing to a DB2 database. And since most of the programming is now done through standard interfaces like JDBC, .NET ODBC, it's really a matter of changing connection parameters. And the effort here is really minimal. Now, once you've taken care of the DDL migration and the application code has been tweaked, now the pointers are pointing to the DB2 database, the next step is obviously the huge amount of data which you've accumulated over the years when the application is up and running and is in production, is to move that data, right? Again, there are various approaches that are available for moving data. DCW is one tool that allows you to do that in the same interface. So that's one of the good features of DCW. You don't have to look at different tools for carrying out this enablement onto DB2. So moving of data, again, there's a tool available which allows you to pretty much do it in one go. And I'll show you how that can be done. Now, like I mentioned, once you've completed all the DDL movement and the data movement, the last step is before you get into production is you want to verify the functionality of the application to make sure that you're getting the right reports that you're getting earlier, you're getting them in the right time, for which you carry out both acceptance tests and performance tuning. Now, acceptance test is fairly straightforward because again, in the version 9.7, where we introduced an interesting parameter called currently committed, which has the same isolation level as that of Oracle. So the semantics are similar, the locking mechanism is similar, so there is no real issue when it comes to the locking mechanism, the deadlock detection and all of that. And yeah, the functionality should work as it is. Talking about performance tuning, you would be happy to know that most of the DB2 configuration parameters are auto-tuned. So there is a lot of push on DB2 autonomics, where what we ensure is that the moment DB2 has there is a database created on DB2, there is a utility that runs in background, and it makes sure that the parameters are set to optimal values, so that there is really no tuning that you need to do. Now, once you've taken care of all of these, things which we do not really cover as part of the migration exercise are things like task scheduling, auditing, if you require a national language support, database partitioning, compression. These are things that you would, again, these are some of them are done at design time, some of them can be enabled later, because all of these functionalities are available in DB2. So you can enable your tables for compression if you need high availability and disaster recovery to be made available, that's something that can be configured. Database partitioning features are available in DB2, so if you're happy with the performance and then you want to partition the database for further gain in performance and other reasons, you definitely can do that. Now, having spoken about the approach that we take for enablement, I'll quickly take you through the tools which are available earlier and what they did for us. So again, why talking about tools? Because if you look at this chart that we have here, it's showing that it's again a combination of the tool as well as the compatibility vector that is available in DB2. Most of the SQL statements or PLSQL statements that are part of your application are pretty much ready to execute on DB2, which leaves us a very small portion of the application that we need to look at. And that's where the amount of effort that you require to carry out a migration exercise reduces drastically. So, in fact, in version 10.1, in the early access program that we had for DB2 version 10.1, we saw that for most of the applications that were chosen for migration, we achieved nearly 98% compatibility, which means that out of the 100% code that we had, we really had to look at only tweaking the 2% of the code which was there. So just imagine if you're looking at 1,000 stored procedures, we were only looking at 20 stored procedures to be looked at and not worry about the remaining 900 odd procedures that we have, which again, like I said, greatly reduces the amount of effort that we put in for migrating applications onto DB2. Right? So to do that, earlier we had something called in early days of version 9.5, we had IBM Migration Toolkit. Again, this would convert all of your PLSQL into SQLPL, because in version 9.5 we didn't really have much support for PLSQL. But 9.7 was a major release when the compatibility vector was introduced, and the PLSQL compiler was built into DB2, and it natively started supporting the PLSQL code. That's when we introduced a couple of additional tools, which called IDMT and Meet. So IDMT is called IBM Data Movement Tool. So like I mentioned, it not only allows us for movement of data, but it also allows us to move the DDL and the other PLSQL objects that are there in the database. So if you are on an Oracle database and you want to try, and you also have a DB2 installation, you want to try how that happens, most of the stuff which is automated can be done using IDMT. So that's when you've decided that you're going to move your application onto DB2. Secondly, Meet is another tool that allows us to understand how much of my application code or how much of my database code is compatible on DB2. So for example, looking at the application, I cannot say if it's 50% compatible or what is the kind of effort that I'm going to put in eventually. So that's something that Meet allows us to assess. It will tell us that the percentage of the code that is going to require certain attention, and it will also show us where exactly we need to tweak the code. So on chart 14 is the application migration evaluation tool and its snapshot. So it's basically a small Java tool wherein you give the most complex piece of code that you have. You can choose to give the entire DDL and the business logic, the stored procedure and user-defined functions as a SQL file, as a text file. It will consume that file and it will parse that file, and it has a knowledge base. It has a knowledge base of the database that you have chosen as a target, and based on it, it will make a comparison as to what are the features that are already existing in DB2, which will make sure that the code which is written in PLSQL is going to be readily executed, and it will also report the PLSQL piece of code where you need certain amount of tweaking needs to be done. For example, in the screenshot, I have shown that the report which you have run is showing that 99% of the SQL statements are ready to be transferred onto DB2, which means you don't really need to touch that portion of the code. So what we're talking about is looking at 1% of the code where you need some amount of changes that need to be made. Manual intervention, if you would like to call. Like I mentioned, Meet is for evaluation and effort estimation in a way. Data movement tool, IDMT, allows us to move data from not just Oracle, but the various databases which are listed here: SQL Server, Access, Sybase, and MySQL, PostgreSQL, and all of that. And yeah, it allows us to move not just the DDLs for tables, views, sequences, constraints, indexes, and all of that, but also the business logic, which is encapsulated in form of procedures, functions, and PLSQL packages, and all of that. And again, for data movement, we have seen that the performance is really good. It can do data loading in parallel from flat files which you have generated from the Oracle dumps that you have. And yeah, it uses the DB2 load functionality, which is quite powerful when we talk about loading bulk amount of data. So yeah, there's also a web link which you can look up for more details on IDMT. It's a free tool to download. All that it requires is a JRE 1.5 or later, and yeah, you just need to be able to connect to both Oracle database and the DB2 database, for which you will require the drivers for the respective databases that you're trying to connect to. Now, these are the tools which are used earlier when we were talking about DB2 9.7. But with the introduction of DB2 10.1, we came up with this fantastic tool called the Database Conversion Workbench. So what this tool is really is basically a plugin that is available with, a plugin that you can use with IBM Data Studio. It provides you all the necessary conversion tools into one integrated development environment. So you don't really have to look at any other tool for completing the enablement exercise. That's really the goal of DCW. So like the chart says, the benefits are really you have a single window, a single dashboard that you're going to use. It does streamline the execution of conversion steps. So as you can see, there are steps involved. you first estimate the effort, you first evaluate what is the SQL code which is given, then you estimate the effort, and then eventually do actual conversion, and then you do the data movement. So there is a step, there's a process to it. So all of that is streamlined in this particular tool. It allows things to be done faster because everything is done in one particular tool. And obviously, whenever you need more features, they can just be added as plugins. So for people who haven't used or who are hearing the term IBM Data Studio for the first time, it's an IDE. Again, I believe it has a free version of it, which you can download from internet. It's an IDE that allows you to work with databases. You can create your tables, views, database objects. You can write your stored procedure functions. You can write SQL scripts, all of it through an IDE. It has a nice IDE. Most of the things can be done through Wizard. You don't need to remember complex DB2 commands to carry out some of the actions that you would otherwise do. So yeah, so that's the tool that we already have, and now DCW comes as a plugin which you can use in the same environment. So it's just another perspective that you switch on to, which is called the Database Conversion Workbench perspective within IBM Data Studio, and you're good to start your migration exercise. Now, talking about the various components that DCW has, so these are the components which are listed here, 5 distinct components. The first one is the evaluation engine, on similar lines to what we had seen with Meet, wherein it takes the SQL code or the DDL and DDL objects and PLSQL objects packages the code for that from Oracle database, and then it assesses the compatibility of the SQL code for the target DB2 database that you've chosen. If you've chosen DB2 9.7, the compatibility will be different. If you've chosen DB2 10.1, the compatibility will be different. Obviously, because 10.1 being the most recent one, you will see that the compatibility ratio will be increased. Again, that depends on what features you have used in the SQL code that you've implemented, right? So evaluation engine is that engine which will tell you that this much percentage of the code is ready to be moved on to DB2. On the other hand, we have the estimation engine, which allows us to get an idea of what is the kind of effort that we're looking at. Let's say the evaluation engine says 97% of the code is ready to be used on DB2. So what about the 3% code? The 3% code might be a small number, but it again depends on the volume of the SQL code that we are looking at. If we have like 10,000 stored procedures, obviously the 3% is going to be a considerable number, right? And then based on the complexity of the code and based on what we're looking at, it will tell us what is the kind of effort that is required, what is the amount of tweaking that is required, are there workarounds which we can readily use. So based on the experience that IBM has gained over the years in converting those hundreds of Oracle applications onto DB2, the estimation engine has a heuristic built in wherein it will tell us that this is the amount of time it's going to take for the application migration or database migration to be considered complete. The third engine that I will talk about is the conversion engine. So conversion engine is really the engine which carries out the conversion. So you have the PLSQL code, and how does it work on DB2? So if there is a slight tweaking to the syntax which needs to be done, this conversion engine will do it for us. So it will make sure that the Oracle's PLSQL code will run on DB2 pretty much as it is, wherever it doesn't require a change. But for certain things where there is an obvious alternative in DB2, that particular change is going to be done by the conversion engine. So again, no manual intervention is required here. The conversion engine will make sure that the code is ready for you to use. Talking about the visualizer engine, this is another engine which is important, and I believe people who have used IBM Data Studio extensively would have seen something similar in form of impact analysis tool. So visualizer engine is another component which allows us to generate object dependency graph. Now the question is, when we're doing migration, why do we really look at object dependency graph? It's important because when we look at an application, let's say we want to find out how many schemas are we trying to move. Let's say there are X number of schemas and we want to prioritize which schema we take first. So for which we might sometime need to understand the relationship between the schemas. If there is inter-schema dependency, there's no point just migrating one schema and leaving the other one not migrating, right? So in such cases, it is very important to understand which schemas can be migrated in isolation, or for example, if there's even the simplest example would be a function. If I'm choosing to migrate one function or another, I need to find out if that function is going to be dependent on any other function, or can I do that in isolation. So that's something the visualizer engine allows us to visualize basically, and I'll also show you the screenshot of how it looks. The last engine that I'm going to talk about is the data movement engine, which obviously does things which are very similar to what IDMT used to do. It allows us to move data from Oracle to DB2, and then and not just Oracle to DB2, but even DB2 to DB2 when we are talking about a DB2 upgrade scenario. Now, when I talked about the various components, engine components, what are the various phases in which you're going to use these components? So when we start with the planning phase, and when we've decided that okay, we are going to go ahead with this enablement, and that's when we are trying to look at the effort estimation, right? When you're trying to assess the feasibility, or when you're trying to do a small POC out of the 100 applications, you take up one application and you want to do a POC. That's when you would use the evaluation engine to figure out the compatibility of the existing application code and the database code, and then you would do an effort estimation using the estimation engine. And then you would also look at the visualizer engine to understand if there is a schema dependency involved, and if you can isolate some of the components, the database components, and move them independently. Now, once you have done that, the next phase is obviously the database conversion phase, wherein you do make use of the conversion engine, which does the most of the conversion for you on its own. And again, you can make use of data movement engine and the conversion engine in tandem. And then there are additional packages. So there is a component called additional package for Oracle, which is shown there. So there are Oracle packages which may not be part of the standard DB2 engine, which sometimes there are workarounds for it available with the team. So they can be also made use of if they're not part of the DB2 engine. So these packages can also be made use of through DCW. And then once the database conversion is complete, you do the application conversion, which is as of today, it's still a manual approach, because we believe that if the SQL is standard, it should work, but just changing the connection parameters. And yeah, eventually when we talk about the deployment, where we talk about moving the production data, then again you can make use of the data movement engine, again part of the same conversion workbench tool. Now, this chart basically shows you the entire details step by step. So the first step that you take for database migration is you need to connect to the source Oracle database. You need to extract the DDL. So when I'm saying extracting DDL, we're not talking about the data, but we're only talking about the DDL for tables, views, functions, indexes, user-defined functions, stored procedures, and triggers. So we extract that DDL into an SQL file, and then we give it to the evaluation engine. And that evaluation engine will report us the compatibility which exists in form of a .html or a .xml file. So for people who do not know this, the compatibility evaluation is, as of today, is done by IBM because it is again based on IBM's experience, previous experience of the various engagements that we have done. So the HTML file gets sent to IBM for effort estimation, and the effort estimation is done by IBM, and it will then be given to the customer and business partner, right? So that's the way it works as of today. There's also a component of conversion assessment questionnaire, the CAQ file, which I mentioned, but DCW does not have a mechanism as of today to consume the CAQ and take that input for compatibility evaluation or for conversion for that matter. So as of now, CAQ is really used for the feasibility of the project, and just to understand if it's a good to go project. The framework for CAQs is still being worked upon. And conversion effort estimation engine, which I already mentioned, is still under the control of IBM. So if you really want to find out for your application what is the amount of effort, what is the kind of man hours you need to spend to get the application up and running on DB2, you really need to get in touch with IBM for that. There's another important tool which I haven't mentioned, or component of DCW is the splitting of DDL files. Often enough, we have seen that because of the amount of data or the amount of objects, DDL objects, or the user-defined functions and stored procedures, If your application is heavily based on database logic, then you will have a huge DDL file. And often enough, it doesn't make sense for us to convert the whole DDL file because sometimes it's not easy, it's not readable, it's not easy to edit that DDL in one particular IDE. So the split DDL file is a beautiful option which allows us to split the DDL based on the type of object it is. For example, split DDL files allows you to create multiple files wherein each file will have, let's say, it creates files like user-defined functions.sql wherein all of the user-defined functions will be in one file. So it will also create tables.sql which will have all the table definitions, DDL for all the tables in that application in one file. So it really makes sure that all of the various database objects are split into individual SQL files. And obviously there is visualized relationships which I talked about, the visualizer engine which allows us to look at the dependencies and decide if you really want to migrate one schema, one object or multiple objects at the same time. And then you have the conversion engine which does the actual conversion, and if there's any manual code fix that needs to be done based on what the evaluation engine reports, you do that and eventually you create the target database onto DB2. So creating target database on DB2 is just a matter of executing the create database statement. Of course, you need to have the compatibility vector enabled so that the PLSQL code can run as it is on DB2. And then once the database is created, you just execute the .sql which contains the converted compatible code. And once the DDLs are registered, then you look at the data movement engine and make use of the data movement engine to extract actual data, the production data from Oracle database, and you extract into and deploy it into DB2. And once that is done, again, if there are any incompatibilities, you fix them in the .sql file and it goes for verification testing. Now, what are the prerequisites for someone to use DCW? DCW is, as of today, is a plugin, like I said. So you need to have IBM Data Studio version 3.1.0 full client version, and you can download that from the link which is shown in the chart. You also need Eclipse Platform SDK, which you can download through, again, Data Studio by going to the update site. And once you have done that, you can you will obviously have DCW as a plugin which you can download. So once you have DCW set up on your machine, which is again a part of IBM Data Studio, there's just a perspective that you need to switch on to, which is the DCW perspective. Once you are in that perspective, it's just a matter of opening another new project, creating a project. So the screenshot shows that in order to create a project, you would say new DCW project, and then you need to choose the source database and the target database, which in our case would obviously be Oracle as the source, and target can be DB2 LUW standalone or DB2 LUW PureScale. So standalone would mean you're trying to look at a single instance, standard DB2 LUW database instance. But if you're looking at an OLTP-based application where the amount of data that you're managing is huge, transactions is something that is a concern, then DB2 PureScale is what we are looking at, right? So if you have a PureScale-based infrastructure in place and you want to migrate your Oracle application onto DB2 PureScale, then the target database that should be chosen must be DB2 LUW PureScale. Now, once you have chosen the source and target, the next step is to obviously extract the DDL for the various database objects, including UDFs, triggers, and functions from the Oracle database. So if you have Oracle connectivity from where the tool is being used, you can connect to the Oracle database and import the DDL. If you do not, then you can have that separately extracted and present to DCW as a flat file or a .sql file. So you can use either of the options, and you can use this import DDL extraction wizard, and you can just import the DDL file for us, which will be then consumed by the evaluation engine, right? So you just say import a DDL file. When you click on finish, it will ask you the path of the file. You just have to point it to the right file, and once you have pointed it to the file will appear in the Project Explorer window. Now, once we have extracted the file, the next step is obviously to evaluate the contents of the file and find out what is the kind of compatibility that I can see for the existing code that I have. So for that, you again go back to the Project Explorer, right-click on the SQL file that you have, and then there's a database conversion option that you have. You just choose the database conversion option, and then you say evaluate and convert. So what it does, it will execute the evaluation engine and the conversion engine simultaneously, and the evaluation engine will basically report the compatibility, which will be in form of a number for you. So as of today, when you're trying to look at the compatibility, like I said, there is an email which is going to be sent to IBM team, which will take a look at who's doing the evaluation, because again, like I said, this comes from prior experience, and we would want to know who are the customers and business partners who are trying to migrate applications onto DB2. So there is an email which gets sent with the actual report, and it does certain validation to ensure that the customer is registered with us. And if the customer is registered with us, the report goes back to the customer in another email, which is again an HTML file, and the user is allowed to look at the evaluation report. So how does the evaluation report look? So on this chart, I'm showing you the evaluation report. So the first thing that it shows is the compatibility ratio. So for example, in this report, we are looking at DB2 10.1 as the target database for DB2. And then the compatibility which is being reported as far as the PLSQL coverage is concerned is 93%. So what it is saying is, out of the thousands of lines of code that is given, 93% of the PLSQL statements can be readily moved on to DB2, and there's only 7% of the code which requires certain amount of attention. Not only that, it does not stop at that. It gives you additional information. So things like the summary of these PLSQL and DDL statements. So if you look at the table at the bottom of the chart, you will see that the DDL summary shows how many create type statements do I have in my DDL, how many create view statements are there, how many create sequence statements are there. And it also shows, out of those statements, how many statements require certain attention, how many statements need a little bit of tweaking. So if you look at the chart, you can see that there is some other type of DDL where the number of those DDLs are 21, out of which there is one DDL that requires certain amount of attention, and the percentage of that is 4.76, right? Similarly, there are 10 create table statements, out of which 3 create table statements require certain attention. So what we're looking at here is it can pinpoint exactly to the area, right to the object which requires attention. So out of the thousands of objects that you have in your application, you don't need to worry about which one to change, which one not to, because the evaluation engine is actually going to pinpoint the right object that you need to focus on. Again, moving on, the detailed statistics, again, part of the same HTML file, will give you more information about what is in the DDL that you have shared with the DCW tool. So it tells you things like what is the maximum line of code in the function, what is the average size of a trigger or a stored procedure, and all of that stuff, which will give you an idea of the amount of effort or amount of code that has been written already. Alongside, it also lists the problem areas, so the areas that require attention. So if you look at the bottom of the chart, you will see that there's a feature and a description for which it shows the count, and it will also show whether the feature is supported. If not, what is the workaround for that. So if you look at this chart, it's actually pinpointing the statement within the DDL that requires certain attention. For example, the feature listed here is execute immediate statement, which it has encountered in the DDL which you gave, and it is telling you that this statement is not going to be working on DB2 as it is. So what you need to do is you need to consult an IBM representative or look at the workaround which is given on one of the wiki pages. So what we are doing is we are not looking at we are not trying to isolate the entire function, but within the function, the right statement which needs to change. And it also shows where to look for information and how to change that. So the solution is already provided. All you need to do is go to the right website and find out what the answer is and then fix it. So it should be a matter of a couple of minutes for you to do that, right? Now, the same approach is going to be taken for all of the objects that require attention. So once you have fixed all the 7% of the code that required attention, you can also see that the converted SQL, because evaluation engine does not run on own, but it also runs the conversion engine, right? So you also will have a converted .SQL file. So as you can see, the after the evaluation and conversion phase is over, the Project Explorer will have another file called the converted .SQL file. So in order to open that file, all you need to do is just double click on the converted.sql file, it will prompt you for a statement terminator, and by default, as of now, I believe DCW has only @ as a valid statement terminator, which you need to use. Once you use that, it's going to generate the converted.sql with the statement generator that you've chosen, which is @, and it will show you the entire new PL/SQL DDL, and which is ready to be used on DB2. So all the manual effort here is eliminated. All you did was went through and wizard, provided it the SQL file, and what you got was converted SQL code, which is now ready to be used on DB2. Now, executing converted DDL, again, it's pretty much the same thing. You just right click on the respective DDL. So the DDL which are listed in this chart are as output of the split DDL process. So when you do a split DDL on a large SQL file, it's going to split them into multiple DDL objects, and you can see the names of the objects which are self-explanatory. So based on whatever objects you want to register, for example, you want to register sequences, you will just use DDL_sequence.sql, right click on it, go to the database conversion wizard, and then say run this SQL file. So while running, there are two things that you need to remember. One is again the statement terminator that you need to choose, and the target database, because you're eventually going to run that on DB2 database. So you need to establish a connection with the DB2 database. So there is another wizard, the connection wizard, which will pop up. It will either have an existing connection, or you need to create one by clicking on a new button. Once you do that, you establish the connection with the database, and you just say finish, on which the DDL which was generated, the SQL file which was generated, the code gets executed on the target database which is selected. And the results are again available for you to see on the results tab, SQL results tab. So you know which objects are getting registered and which ones are not. Right? So that's fairly straightforward. You have DDLs and all your business logic, user-defined functions, stored procedures, all of them taken care of by the evaluation and conversion engine. The next step is obviously how do I move my data. So again, DCW provides you with these various options for moving data. You can move data from, you can extract data into flat files from Oracle and then move it. Or you can also use something called as pipes, which is a mechanism which is used for bulk amount of data. And you can use the load options which are there, load data from flat files using DCW, or you can manually load the data as well, which we don't recommend because the tool itself is pretty efficient in loading data. So again, there's another wizard that you walk through for loading data and extracting data from Oracle. And while, again, loading data, you do not need to load all of the data. You can be selective about the data that you want to move. You can choose data, again, schema by schema. So it will list all the schemas that are available in Oracle, and you can choose one of them that you want to move. And then basically the number of threads, because it can do data loading in parallel. And you can also generate scripts if you want the DB to load scripts to be preserved for later use. The wizard allows you to generate those scripts. Talking about the usage of pipes, it's something that is recommended for bulk data movement when you have a data warehouse sort of an environment, and when you don't want to have the data files created on the file system, but just move them through programs without any temporary storage being occupied. That's when you can make use of the use pipe option. All you need to do is just check the particular checkbox, and it will make use of the pipes, and it will not create any temporary files. Talking about loading data from flat files, again, if you have moved data from Oracle, you have exported data into flat files, there is a load data wizard that allows you to load data from those flat files, and should just be a matter of establishing connection with DB2 and pointing it to the right DDL file, SQL file, and the data gets loaded inside DB2, right? Again, once you've loaded the data, because it's IBM Data Studio environment, you can just right-click on in the Data Source Explorer on the connection that you have established for the database and refresh the connection so that the newly populated data is visible in the wizard. Once you refresh and when you go to a particular target table, you can just say right-click on the table and say return all rows, and it should show you all the records that are inserted inside that table in the SQL results tab. Something that you would do in any case when you're using IBM Data Studio. It should be a fairly easy task. Now, that's the overall process for converting your application or database code, which is in Oracle, to DB2. Special mention about the estimation engine, which I mentioned that it's not something that we distribute because there is a heuristic that IBM applies based on the prior experience, and that heuristic is not something that we would like to share with the external world. And yeah, so if you really want to get an effort estimation as to what is the number of man hours that I'm going to spend on this activity, you can very well get in touch with IBM team or one of us. We have a whole bunch of people worldwide who carry out this task day in and day out, and this is the subject matter experts on this, and they will be able to give you the right guidance as to what is the kind of effort that you're looking at for enabling your application. And believe me, we have seen that most of the application enablements have been done in a matter of weeks. Something that used to be done as a project for half year or 1 year, now we can do it in a matter of weeks. We have done few migrations which have done in a matter of 2 to 4 weeks. So what we're talking about, in a month's time, you have an application up and running on Oracle, on DB2, which was earlier running on Oracle. Also, like I mentioned, package visualizer, it helps us reveal the dependencies between various database objects. It helps us isolate some of the database objects. Let's say if there's a problem creating object, object which is pretty complex, which cannot be readily moved on to DB2, and if you want to isolate it, it's important to know what are the other objects which are going to be impacted because of the isolation. That's when, again, package visualizer comes in really handy and helps us determine the scope of project, the scope of the work that we're looking at. And again, it's something which is accessible in the DB2 Object Explorer view. Yeah, here is a snapshot of how it looks. So what we have done here is we have picked up a function called count projects. So when we just right click on the function and we say show us the package visualization, it shows that, okay, it's talking to, or it's reading information or maybe writing information to 2 different tables, employee and accounts table. So it's fairly easy to visualize that, okay, if one particular object is impacted, what are the other things that are going to be impacted eventually. So it's really a great tool to make use of. Right? So far I mentioned about Oracle migration and moving database from Oracle to DB2, but yeah, DCW, the tool that we have, also allows us to upgrade DB2 from earlier versions of DB2, which is 9.7 and prior, to DB2 10.1. Again, the process is pretty much similar, except that you don't really have to worry about a lot of conversion because it is DB2 code which is going to be moved eventually. But yes, for DB2 scale, for moving from DB2 standalone to DB2 pure scale, there is a compatibility report and there is a compatibility assessment which is done, because the compatibility report will tell you what are the features of existing DB2 environment that can be run on pure scale environment also, because pure scale is a different environment, slightly different environment, sophisticated one, but yet not all the features which are supported in DB2 as of now are supported on DB2 pure scale. So it's going to generate a compatibility report. You will take a look at the report, and based on, if you see that compatibility is still okay with you, then you go ahead with the actual exercise. So yeah, DB2 migration is something that you would want to try as well if it's a matter of moving from standalone to DB2 pure scale. Now, that's pretty much what I had on DCW. So the next step is for people who are curious to know about and try it hands-on, because the best way is to get your hands dirty and start working on it. So I shared a couple of download links, one for the database conversion workbench itself. But please remember that this is in form of a plugin, so there are prerequisites. You will need IBM Data Studio Full Client 3.1.1, and you need to have an update of the software development kit. And once you have that, you're good to go. And there is also a link for downloading the trial version of DB2 10.1. Again, it's free of cost for probably 90 days. You can make use of that and exploit all the valuable features that DB2 has to offer. So with that, I conclude my talk and I open the floor for any questions. Mohini, do you have any questions?
We're just waiting for the questions, Mr. Millar.
Okay.
I have assigned you some questions, Mr. Mularaswamy. Can you see them?
Yes, I can see them. So let me read out the first question, which is from Lakshman Reddy. Uh, um, yeah, so the question is, I wanted to know whether this DB2 can be used for data mining and for data warehousing concepts. So yeah, the answer is yes. So DB2 has various flavors, all right. DB2 is not only used for OLTP environment. I mean, DB2 is right from mainframes to distributed operating systems. So LUW stands for Linux, Unix, and Windows. So DB2 has flavors for distributed operating systems. And there are various editions available. So for DB2 on standalone environment where you're talking about transaction processing, the enterprise version is called Enterprise Standard Edition, or more recently the Advanced Enterprise Standard Edition, which is being used. But for warehouse environments, we have the base edition of DB2 is called InfoSphere Warehouse. InfoSphere Warehouse that comes with the reason for having these two different editions is InfoSphere Warehouse is the DB2 DPF environment, is the database partitioning feature, and that's more suited for the warehouse environment. It scales well, it performs well, and it also comes bundled with a lot of the data mining and other features, tools which you require for doing a lot of analytics. So yes, DB2 has a version for the warehouse environment. Now, Mr. Avinash K has another question. He says, how to debug PLSQL in DB2 to identify a problem? Okay, so I believe Data Studio has debugging capability. So IBM Data Studio has the capability to debug PLSQL code just like you would debug any other regular code. I do not have a link handy at this point in time, but I do know that we have a debugger for PLSQL, and we've used that in many of these situations where the PLSQL stored procedure is quite lengthy, and we need to go through each step to understand where it is going wrong. So to answer your question, it does exist, and it is part of the IBM Data Studio tool. Now, there's another question from Mr. Dinesh Vyas. He's asking, is DeveloperWorks available for Mac? I probably don't understand the question because DeveloperWorks is apparently a website, and it should be accessible through any web client, which is a browser. So if you're asking, is DB2 available on Mac, I understand that there are things which have been worked upon. My understanding is there was a beta version released earlier for Mac, but I'm not sure if DB2 10.1 beta is available for Mac as yet. So something that I need to get back to you on. Okay, Mr. Avinash K has another question. How to debug a stored procedure in DB2 and see the result while debugging? Again, I would suggest you look at the IBM Data Studio user documentation because, like I said, it's a matter of stepping in and stepping out, just like you would do for a Java code. I understand there are a couple of phases that are involved. You need to right-click on the object that you're trying to deploy. You say deploy, and while deploying, there's an option of enable debug. So if you choose enable debug, it deploys the code in debug mode, and then you can step through the code using just normal keys F5, F6. I think step in, step out, and step over. I might be wrong in the sequence that I'm saying, but yes, that's something that is possible. Okay, the following question again from Mr. Avinash is, from which version debugging is supported and any option needed to be enabled while creating procedure? Yes, so like I mentioned, in IBM, if you're going to deploy your database objects through IBM Data Studio, then while you right-click on the stored procedure, the PLSQL code that you're trying to deploy, there is an option of enabling debugging. So if you choose enable debug and then deploy it, then it goes into the debug mode, and then you can step through the code and you can get to the root cause of the problem.
Well, those were the only questions, Mr. Malarswamy. I'm really thankful to you for conducting this webinar. It was indeed a great session. I would also like to thank all our participants for their support in making this webinar a success. The recording of the session would be available on techgeek.com by tomorrow. Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Thanks.